Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. I am going to continue my podcast. This is Turning the Tide, Noam Chomsky. It's part two of basically it's chapter three, the patterns of intervention. We're going to try to get through half that chapter. It's a long chapter. It's almost 80 pages. So I'm going to try to get through that chapter, and hopefully I'll be able to finish half of it. And then tomorrow I'll come back and do the next half, and then we'll continue like that and finish the book. It should be done in 3 to 4 days. So I'm going to continue the U.S. and El Salvador. It's in historical perspective. Current U.S. intervention in El Salvador also breaks little new ground apart from the scale. In 1930 through 1932, thousands of peasants were massacred in the Matanza as Hernandez Martinez took power. He was duly recognized by the U.S. while going through the forms of an election in which he was the only candidate. The population was traumatized and subdued by the Matanza. The effectiveness of the Matanza at suppressing dissent was indicated by the passage of over a generation before rural organizing began again. As late as 1978, our reporter quoted a conservative lawyer who stated, "Whenever the peasants make the least demand, people start talking about 1932 again. Power remained in the hands of a tiny oligarchy of about 100 major families who enriched themselves and foreign investors while much of the population starved or emigrated." Here, as elsewhere, the U.S. wanted stability, benefited from the ongoing system, and was therefore content to work with the military oligarchy complex that ruled most of Central America from the 1820s to the 1980s. Historian Thomas Anderson comments that the whole political labyrinth of El Salvador can be explained only in reference to the traumatic experience of the uprising of the Matanzas, while Jean Kirkpatrick assures us that to many Salvadorans, the violence of this repression seems less important than the fact of restored order and the 13 years of civil peace that ensued, an accurate rendition of the views of those Salvadorans who count. No problems arose in one of the world's most miserable countries until 1960, when a junior officer's coup established a moderately leftist government that lasted for only a few weeks before the other officers, responding to pressures from the oligarchy and the United States, staged a counter-coup, a foretaste that was to come 20 years later. The U.S. Embassy urged support for the military regime, stating that the internal security forces are behind the present government, are strongly anti-communist, and constitute major force for stability and orderly political and economic development. Their rule was necessitated by subversion and anti-government activities, such as underground propaganda, the embassy explained, offering an insight into the concept of subversion and understood by the Kennedy liberals. Dr. Fabio Castillo, a former president of the National University, testified before Congress that the U.S. had openly participated in the counter-coup and had opposed the holding of free elections. The conservative junta was quickly recognized by President Kennedy, whose preference for many civil military regimes was noted earlier after they had pledged to take tough actions against the students who had protested against the outlawing of political parties, the main proof offered by a communist plot, cut relations with Castro, and warmly welcomed foreign investment. The trends of the earlier years continued. Production, including food production, increased, largely for export, along with starvation and general misery. These trends were enhanced by the Alliance for Progress programs of Kennedy and Johnson. By 1969, 300,000 El Salvadorans, 1 in 8 citizens, had fled to Honduras to find food and work. Military aid rapidly increased, along with U.S. training and coordination of the military and other security forces in the region. The threat of subversive acts in distributing propaganda, which justified support of a military dictatorship in 1961, still remains an unsolved problem. Christian Democrats have recently acknowledged with candor that the immediate threat that political accommodation with the rebels could pose. Sam Dillon of the Miami Herald reports, the problem, as explained by one of President Duarte's aides, is that 6 months after we sign a peace treaty, and the leftists start wandering around the country, organizing legally, all the agrarian reform cooperatives would turn communist. Another problem is that the left might organize among school-age youth and in the labor movement. Shirley Christian reports in the Times that the National Federation of Trade Unions is making tough wage demands, and the Christian Democrats say they are haunted by the memory of 1979, when the same groups were prominent in the near anxiety that swept El Salvador, leading to the October 1979 coup, soon taken over with Carter's assistance by the right-wing military. By mid-1980s, the agitation dried up as army street activists joined the guerrillas and others disengaged out of fear of their lives, while the government imposed the wage freeze, the state of siege amidst accusations of human rights violations. Now the fear of these dangerous groups who acknowledge their former affiliation with the political arm of the guerrillas may attempt to reactivate the mass organizations that were thankfully destroyed by the violent repression of strikes and demonstrations, along with other Carter-Reagan atrocities left unmentioned. For example, the murder or disappearance of thousands of union activists and workers, which somehow tends to have a dampening effect on labor organization. As always, the current problem is to devise something that will pass for democracy among commentators at home. Not a difficult task, as we shall see, so that aid will flow unhampered to allow the security forces to do their murderous work while ensuring that quote-unquote democracy excludes democracy. Though this oppression of Salvadoran labor under the U.S.-imposed governments has elicited little interest, the diligent reader can find an occasional report. Thus, some notice was taken when, in February 1984, 9 labor leaders, including all top officials and of one major federation, were arrested in a Catholic retreat center by armed police. The police raid was based on an alleged tip that rifles and bazookas were stored there, but the police conceded that they had found no weapons. Although they did confiscate most of the union files, union leaders charged that they were forced to sign written confessions after a week of interrogation, sometimes beatings. None was charged with a crime. The official accusation was that they were planning to present demands to management for higher wages and benefits and promoting strikes, which destabilized the economy. A U.S. official stated that the embassy had followed the arrest closely and was satisfied that the correct procedures were followed. The union attack had never held a meeting under its own name. Fearing arrest or death squad attacks in 1980 to 1981, some 8,200 union members were murdered, wounded, or disappeared, according to an estimate by one labor group. Salvadoran law requires yearly meetings of unions to elect leaders, while another law bans such meetings as illegal except with police permission, which is seldom granted. The arrests in this case were part of the general government crackdown on unions in preparation for the much praised March 25 elections, or as the press preferred, the police action came despite government promises to loosen restrictions on political freedom in preparation for the elections. Such preparations went unnoticed in the general ecstasy over the democratic renewal in El Salvador a few weeks later. So you can see, the El Salvador, basically, murder of the union people, the murder and disappearance of thousands of union activists. Because why is that? Why does Washington want to murder all these activists? Why do the sadistic, bestial, savage butchers want to disappear, grab them off the street, throw them into a van, take them to a nice corner of El Salvador and shoot them in the head like they did and the Texas Rangers did and their army did in Vietnam and all over the place? Why do they want to do that? Because unions are a threat to Washington's capitalists, right? I mean, if you can enslave the poor third world peoples, then you can, take advantage and your cash is, saved. So the people of El Salvador, they grabbed them off the street. They were union activists. They were trying to get, equal wages and raise their wages. And Washington said, no, you can't have high wages. You can have murder if you want high wages. That's, Washington, the racist white government lynch mob, genocidal, bestial American butchers. So continuing on, contemporary state terrorism. the system established. Nicaragua was treated much as El Salvador under Kennedy's program of strengthening the power of the military and security forces through Latin America. Under the Alliance for Progress, military aid to Somoza rose sevenfold while economic assistance doubled. The energy the United States injected into the country in the form of moral support, economic aid, and military muscle discouraged opponents of the regime, enriched the brothers of Somoza, and increased their capacity to co-opt and repress their compatriots and to weather a wave of internal unrest from 1959 to 1963. At the same time, the U.S. formed a Central American Defense Council, CONDECA, unifying the armed forces of all Central American nations apart from Costa Rica and thus permitting more efficient internal repression. Nicaragua reciprocated by serving as a base for this attack against Cuba in 1961, as it had for the CIA coup in Guatemala in 1954, sending troops to aid in the U.S. invasion of Dominican Republic in 1965, and intervening with Guatemalan forces to help defeat a reformist coup in El Salvador after the election was stolen by the military in 1972. The Alliance for Progress programs of strengthening internal security forces took a still more ominous turn in El Salvador with the establishment of the military and paramilitary apparatus, thus was to be responsible for widespread slaughter in the coming years. According to Alan Nairn's detailed study, the U.S. organized and trained a rural paramilitary force, Orden, which had terrorized the countryside since, as well as the elite presidential intelligence service, ANSEAL, which served as the intelligence arm of the death squads. The founder of Orden and ANSEAL, General Medrano, was enlisted as a CIA agent. Described by Jose Napoleon Duarte as the father of the death squads, the chief assassin of them all, he was awarded a silver medal by President sadist Lyndon B. Johnson in recognition of exceptionally meritorious service. Medrano stated that Orden and ANSEAL grew out of the State Department, the CIA, and the Green Berets during the time of Kennedy. Parallel domestic security agencies were established in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, Honduras, and Costa Rica, and would meet every 3 months under the supervision of the State Department and exchange information and methods of cooperation. Medrano added this was part of a broad plan to organize a Central American intelligence effort under CIA coordination to control internal dissidents, parallel in CONDECA. Nairn reports further that according to U.S. and Salvadoran officials, the close relations between the security forces and the U.S. government have been sustained since, at times with some qualms, now overcome under the Reagan administration. The U.S. provided coordination and training, including training in terrorist and torture techniques, according to Salvadoran intelligence officers and former police agents, both in El Salvador and the United States. The CIA also provided information about suspected dissidents and Salvadorans abroad, many of whom were assassinated by the death squads that are actually part of the military and security forces. Nairn concludes, U.S. complicity in the dark and brutal work of El Salvador's death squads is not an aberration. Rather, it represents a basic bipartisan, Democrat and Republican, institutional commitment on the part of 6 American administrations, a commitment to guard the Salvadoran regime against the prospect that its people might organize in ways unfriendly to the regime of the United States. So as you can see, Lyndon Johnson, the sadistic, white, racist, genocidal, bestial, savage butcher of Washington and the United States, basically, gave a Medal of Honor to, General Medrano, who was a CIA agent and was a bloodlusted criminal. He was, responsible for the widespread slaughter of El Salvadoran people. He was described as the father of the death squads, and it was awarded a silver medal by President Johnson in recognition of exceptionally meritorious service. Such brutal methods as, slaughter, execution-style murder, and, immediate kidnappings, amputations, burning of, alive people, burning of people in battery acid, cutting their spine, breaking their spine. The typical thing that the US government does, they call the mafia or the US military when, a third world person, gets out of line and they want to break their bones or break their spine. That is what the US government is about. A mass murdering regime of, white, supremacists, genocidal anti-third world racist butchers. Continuing on, Nair's conclusion understates the case, and since it isolates El Salvador from the general context of U.S. foreign policy, which has had the same institutional commitments with much the same effect throughout a large part of the world, and for good reason, as we have seen. Death squads were, in fact, a natural, if not inevitable, outgrowth of the counterinsurgency ideology of the New Frontier, itself a concomitant of the Alliance for Progress programs of strengthening production for the export at the expense of domestic consumption. It was necessary to prevent subversive activities as distribution of propaganda and organizing. General William Yarbough of Kennedy's Special Forces urged that secret paramilitary groups capable of carrying out violent covert actions against the domestic opposition would be an effective mechanism to counter subversion. This structure should be used as necessary, execute paramilitary sabotage and or terrorist activities against known communist proponents, he explained. A U.S. Army handbook suggested that security forces impersonate guerrillas while carrying out terrorist actions against the population to indicate to the people the need for protection of the village and provide the government with a pretext for population control, quote unquote. A Salvadoran military journal reflecting the counterinsurgency doctrine of their U.S. trainers observes that wherever a guerrilla is found operating with success, there are still some among the people cooperating with them and providing information. What then must be done? You must annihilate the source of support and their sources of information. The U.S. applied a concept outlined for Vietnam, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff observed in a document on pacification that class conflict in villages could be effectively exploited, with the young elite who are ambitious to get ahead in business, professions, or politics mobilized for civilian counter-terrorist organization, meaning paramilitary terrorist organization. In Central America, the young elites were trained to sow terror to protect their interests, which happened to coincide with the United States' interests. There was also a flow in the other direction, as U.S. advisors who helped set up the terror system in Guatemala moved on to apply their skills in Vietnam. The U.S. terror network is worldwide. Police units were formed in Guatemala to lend assistance in cases of emergency to the owners of administrators of states, haciendas, agricultural lands, forests, and rural properties, and observe all activity that tends to inflame passions among the peasant masses or in the rural communities. And when necessary, repress through illicit means any disorder that should occur according to a 1965 government decree. A concept of licit means covers quite a bit of ground under the US-backed dictatorships. In general, the basic idea was to develop a paramilitary system working closely with the professional security forces to lock the stable door before the danger ever arises. The words of Truman's Secretary of War, Robert Patterson, in 1947. The Kennedy administration succeeded in putting the system of state terror in place under the guise of counterinsurgency with gruesome consequences. The system was to be preventive, not reactive. In 1962, Kennedy's ambassador to Guatemala, John Bell, sent to Washington a Guatemalan internal defense plan which formulated the primary objective of the U.S. in Guatemala, the prevention of the accession to power of communists in Guatemala, not the needs of the suffering population. The danger of insurgency was remote, Bell held, but the internal defense plan observed. The danger of other forms of subversion, forms which provide a base from which insurgency can develop, is real and present. Therefore, the internal security apparatus must be improved to nip any such dangers in the bud. Like the Duarte government today in El Salvador, Belt perceived the danger of allowing the left to organize politically, since such subversion, quote unquote, might impede the fifth freedom to rob and exploit and harm its local affiliates. Social reforms may be considered, but they are dangerous too. The plan notes that better education might make people all the more aware of the hopelessness of their status, the more susceptible to command agitation. It is better to send helicopter gunships, which will be great utility in rescue operations and in other tasks, in community assistance, as Ambassador Bell's successor thoughtfully explained in 1967, while the security forces with direct U.S. military participation were in the process of slaughtering thousands of peasants. Kennedy's military and counterinsurgency advisor, General Maxwell Taylor, pointed out in 1965 that in Vietnam, we were too late in recognizing the extent of the subversive threat. By April 1965, when the outright U.S. land invasion of South Vietnam took place, some 160,000 South Vietnamese had been killed, largely by U.S. terror operations, according to figures cited by the bitterly anti-communist French military historian Bernard Fall. Many of them under the crushing weight of American armor, napalm, jet bombers, and finally vomiting gases, which is what Fall said, with some 80,000 killed by 1961 in state terror operations that had finally evoked resistance. But this was not enough. We had not come to the rescue of the people we were assassinating in time or with sufficient violence. The outstanding lesson of this experience, Taylor explained to the police academy cadets, is that we should never let another Vietnam-type situation arise again. We have learned the need for a strong police force and a strong police intelligence organization to assist in identifying early the symptoms of an incipient subversive situation so that appropriate measures can be taken in time by terror beyond that employed in South Vietnam if necessary. Recall Keenan's strictures 15 years earlier about the necessity of police repression by the local government. The need for preemption runs through the thinking of American planners across the spectrum and is not restricted to state terror directed by against the civilian population, as in the favored Kennedy model. General Nathan Twining, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Eisenhower, explained that tactical nuclear weapons, if employed once or twice on the right targets at the right time, would, in my judgment, stop current aggression and stop future subversion and limited wars before they start. As example of the worldwide subversion we must counter by nuclear weapons if necessary. He cited the Congo, where U.S. intervention had helped finally assassinate the leading nationalist figure of Lumumba, and to install a corrupt and brutal military dictator. Cuba and Vietnam, by aggression, he clearly meant to refer to this kind of aggression then being carried out by the Vietnamese against the American invaders. One may imagine the reaction of such statements if such statements were found in a publication by the top Soviet or Libyan military commanders. So you can see, summarizing, you can see that Eisenhower, well, let's start with Guatemala. Basically, all the social reforms, they were not interested in that. We were not interested in social reforms. The Guatemalan people wanted social reforms. We were interested in slaughtering hundreds and thousands of peasants. That's what the United States government was interested in. Ambassador Bell's successor complained in 1967 that while the security forces with direct U.S. military intervention were in the process of slaughtering thousands of peasants. So that is under Johnson, the Secretary of State. The Ambassador Bell was under Johnson. Then next, we could turn to the South Vietnamese. We use gas. We use gases. We don't talk about that. Washington doesn't discuss the gases they used against the poor people of, Indochina, right? We use gas. He said vomiting gases. This is Bernard Fall, an anti-communist right-winger. He is saying that we use vomiting gases, napalm, jet bombers. I mean, gas is against international law. What is this about, to the Congress of the United States and the president, that did this? What is this about? What is this bestiality against the poor people of Indochina? Maybe it's just white angry vigilante lynch mob type imperialism or colonial butchery. So, and then finally, Eisenhower. We talked about Eisenhower, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Nathan Twining, basically worldwide subversion. He murdered Lumumba, the democratic leader of Congo. He murdered and replaced a brutal dictator. And, the Vietnamese and the Cubans were aggressing against us, right? I mean, the Vietnamese and Cubans were aggressing against the United States military. When the United States military went there and started a bombing campaign and, terrorist murder campaign against the Vietnamese peasants, we are, calling them the aggressor. That is Washington's delusional frauds. They are vicious white delusional frauds, just white delusional frauds, fraud whites of the U.S. government. The system applied, torturing El Salvador, Carter's War. Returning to El Salvador in 1972, an election took place in which Jose Napoleon Duarte and Guillermo Ungo were the apparent victors, though the military candidate won through blatant fraud and intervention by two U.S. loyal clients, Nicaragua and Guatemala. Interest here was slight. Duarte came to Washington, but found that no one cared much about the reign of terror and political repression inside El Salvador. The press was unconcerned, and apart from Edward Kennedy and Tom Harkin, no one in Congress would even see him. Another electoral fraud in 1977 also aroused little interest here. Terror, torture, starvation, and semi-slave labor continued in the normal manner of U.S. third world dependencies. This recent history illustrates the traditional U.S. contempt for democracy and the cynicism of the current flurry of interest in elections and democracy as a cover for state terror. Two developments did, however, begin to cause concern by the late 1970s. The fall of Somoza in 1979 aroused fears in Washington that the brutal dictator of El Salvador might be overthrown, leading to the loss of control there as well. The second and still more threatening development was the growth of popular organizations in the 1970s, Bible study groups that became self-help groups under church sponsorship, peasant organizations, unions, and the like. There was the fearsome prospect that El Salvador might move towards meaningful democracy with opportunities for real popular participation in the political process. This was the near anarchy memory of which still haunts the Christian Democrats, according to Shirley Christian, at least those she regards as meriting attention. The Carter administration reacted to these threats in El Salvador by backing up a coup led by reformist military officers in October 1979, while ensuring that most reactionary military elements retained a position of dominance. Killings rapidly increased, and by early 1980s, the junta had collapsed. Left Christian Democrats, socialists, and reformist leaders were gone, and power was firmly in the hands of the usual elements whom the U.S. has traditionally supported in the region. Jose Napoleon Duarte, however, joined the junta and in December 1980 became its president, exercising little influence but providing the annual forces which were slaughtering the Salvadoran civilians in the tens of thousands in 1980 and 1981. With an effective public relations spokesman, the role he has continued to play since, to mounting applause in the U.S. as the slaughter seemed to achieve some results. By the early 1980s, the stage was set for outright war against the population of El Salvador. The archbishop was assassinated in March. The war against the peasantry began in full force in May, with major massacres under the guise of land reform, quote unquote. The university was destroyed in June. The leadership of the political opposition was murdered in November. The independent media was terrorized and eliminated, and in general, the popular organizations were crushed with large-scale killings and torture, including mutilations and decapitations, arm and leg amputations, spinal cord paralysis, accompanied by the silence of the U.S. press. The threat of democracy was aborted so that soon it became possible to contemplate elections. Let us review those steps in Carter's war in El Salvador. In February 1980, the Archbishop Romero pleaded with President Carter not to provide the junta with military aid, which he observed will surely increase injustice here and sharpen the repression that has been unleashed against the people's organizations fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights. Political power, he wrote, is in the hands of the armed forces who know only how to repress the people and defend the interests of the El Salvadoran oligarchy. It is beyond doubt that increasingly it is the people themselves that are becoming conscientized and organized, and thereby preparing itself to take the initiative and shoulder the responsibility for the future of El Salvador. The people organizations are the only social force capable of resolving the crisis. It would be totally wrong and deplorable if the Salvadoran people were to be frustrated, repressed, or in any way impeded from the deciding for itself the economic and political future of our country by intervention on the part of a foreign power. But interesting, the repression, destroying the people's organizations, and preventing independence were the very essence of U.S. policy. So Carter ignored the Archbishop's plea and sent the massive aid to strengthen the Army's key role in reforms, quote unquote, a statement that would have made Orwell cringe. The results were predictable at this point. We entered the system illustrated in the first chapter, which we discussed was the murderous campaign in El Salvador. Romero's plea to Carter and to refrain from destroying the popular organizations by violence was not unique. 3 years later, James Cardinal Sin, leader of the 42 million Catholic community in the Philippines, urged Reagan to halt military aid to the Marcos dictatorship because Filipinos were being slaughtered and massacred by American weapons. The plea, too, was ignored by the government and barely noted in the media. In March 1980, Archbishop Romero was assassinated. A judicial investigation was initiated, headed by Judge Atilio Ramirez. He accused General Medrano, the death squad organizer and U.S. favorite, and right-wing leader Robert D'Ossen of hiring the assassins shortly after, fled the country after death threats and an attempt on his life. In exile, Judge Ramirez reports that the criminal investigation section of the National Police did not arrive until 4 days after the assassination and did not provide the court any data of evidence of an investigation into the crime. The same was true of the Office of the Attorney General. Judge Ramirez concludes that it is undoubtedly the case that from the very beginning, they were involved in a kind of conspiracy to cover up the murder. The security forces were entirely inactive, however. They did raid the legal office of the Archbishop, removing all files bearing on the assassination, including testimony implicating the military. None of this evidence has surfaced, and neither the U.S. government nor the press seems much interested. The director of Church Legal Aid Office also fled the country after death threats and warnings that his children and wife would be killed. The officers repeatedly raided the security forces, and human rights leaders have been harassed and murdered, along with little notice in the press here, apart from reiteration of government lies that they were guerrillas. Former Salvadoran intelligence chief Robert Santibanez charged that a senior officer of the Contras, Colonel Ricardo Lau, was paid $120,000 for arranging the Archbishop's assassinations, working directly for Robert de Bosbison, and also played a key role in organizing and training death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala before joining the Contras. Lau has also been linked to political killings inside Honduras of Honduran military officials. U.S. officials confirmed that Lau, a former officer of Somoza's National Guard, served as intelligence chief for the main Contra force, the FDN. The Times reported in the early 1985 that until recently, he was the head of FDN counterintelligence. The Honduran military leaked a report implicating Contra elements in the death or disappearance of some 250 people through 1980, though Honduran human rights activists suspect the involvement of the Honduran security forces, which have taken to the usual practices of our Central American clients as the presence and training expanded. Among those killed were union activists, school teachers, and others. In September 1985, a Honduran army officer, who was a leading figure in a group of military officers who opposed U.S. policy in Honduras, was found murdered under suspicious circumstances near a Contra zone in Honduras. Nicaraguan allies have been accused in the murder. He had charged that the United States was turning a blind eye to murderous abuses in the military, and in some cases, perhaps even encouraging those murders. According to a Western diplomat, a Senate aide who knew the assassinated officer said that if he made public what he knew about the Honduran army and U.S. policy in Honduras, it would be deeply embarrassing to the United States. So reviewing the last couple of pages, we can see, the Carter administration, the sadistic bestial butcher of Washington, Jimmy Carter, he backed a coup, reformist in October 1979, allowing the reactionary government to stay in place. And, killings were just, the norm, standard stuff, torture, terror, amputations, infants being banged against rocks, women gang raped, their uterus cut out and their womb placed in their mouth, the children pulled out of women's pregnant bellies like iguanas, eggs being pulled out of an iguana. This sort of thing is what the bestial savages of, the United States Congress and President, Jimmy Carter in particular, and his, Democratic congressional people, did to the El Salvadoran and poor people. This is the standard thing, the white, animalistic, savage butchers of Washington. Then again, Romero came and pleaded with Carter and said he wanted, please stop the aid. And Carter, said he doesn't care what Romero says. Romero was saying that, they're murdering the peasants and they're, basically, murdering the professors, the Hispanic scholars. All of these people are being murdered by Washington. And Romero came and pleaded. And, Carter said, no, we're going to continue the aid. I'm sorry, you're mistaken. And, what happened? More professors were murdered. The universities were bombed. All of that stuff was done by the United States government. The purpose is to destroy democracy. The American government is interested in destroying democracy and creating a white fascist republic of enslaved Hispanics in El Salvador. And that's what they did here. They created an enslaved group of Hispanic people under the destruction of democracy and fascism under a white dictator, Jose Napoleon Duarte, and that was the evidence of the events. Basically that was it. So, children and wives were killed. The standard stuff, the U.S. government standard stuff. So continuing on. Santibanez also provided detailed evidence concerning the role of leading figures in the Duarte government, as well as the rightist opposition in the state terrorism and cover-up, including the killing of 4 American church women and the assassination of the archbishop. He also described contacts with members of the Contra army who supplied hitmen and with Guatemalan state terrorists, including leaders of an ultra-right party that was formed with CIA assistance as part of the 1954 campaign to destroy Guatemalan democracy. These and other charges, including the charge that the chief of the Treasury Police, who had been implicated in some of the worst atrocities, was on the CIA payroll, and that elements of the U.S. government supported or acquiesced to death squad activity, were investigated by the Senate, which claimed to find no evidence that the U.S. was implicated in political violence. The report, however, does not pretend to be the final word on the subject. Washington correspondent Daniel Sutherland observes, since it did not even interview Salvadorans believed to have information about death squads and ultimately limited itself to U.S. government sources. Carter's war against the peasantry began in full force in May, with large-scale massacres, primarily in areas scheduled for land reform. The first major massacre was the Rio Sumpol on May 14th, when thousands of peasants fled to Honduras to escape an army operation. As they were crossing the river, they were attacked by helicopters, members of Orden, and troops. According to eyewitness testimony reported by Amnesty International and the Honduran clergy, women were tortured, nursing babies were thrown into the air for target practice. Children were drowned by soldiers or decapitated and slashed to death with machetes. Pieces of their bodies were thrown to dogs. Honduran soldiers drove survivors back to the hands of the Salvadoran forces. At least 600 unburied corpses were prey for dogs and buzzards, while others were lost in the waters of the river, which was contaminated from the dead bodies. Bodies of 5 children were found in a fish trap by a Honduran fisherman. The massacres are not mentioned in the State Department. Country reports on human rights practice produced by the Carter administration and was suppressed by the media for over a year, and only barely noted, though the facts had been reported shortly after the events in the foreign press and the church-based press in the United States. This was just one example of news suppression and extreme that reporting of El Salvador was selected as top censor story of 1980 by the annual Media Research Project, not because there were no reports, but because they were so biased and inadequate. As noted earlier, it was later implicitly conceded that the media suppression was deliberate. With the U.S. press silent and the public unaware, the massacre of the peasantry could continue. Peasants were the major victims of the 1980 state terror. In June, the university was shut down after an army attack that left many killed, including the rector, and facilities looted and destroyed. The dean of the Department of Science and Humanities reports in exile. The army burned complete libraries. In the law school, where once we had about 100,000 volumes, we now have only 3,000. In the first days of the occupation, the officers of the army grabbed as much of the equipment, furniture, medical supplies as they could, and the rest they destroyed. Whatever equipment they didn't understand, they ruined. For example, when they found the computer machinery, they tossed bombs and destroyed all of the university's records. In the agronomic science department, they discovered infrared equipment. The officers told their troops that the students used these torture rooms against policemen in the army, so they destroyed them. Medical equipment and most of the medical library were also destroyed. The humanities building and the books were burned to the ground. Some 30 faculty members were murdered or disappeared, according to the new rector. As the university, what is left of it, reopened 4 years later, the librarian observed that no public official, including President Duarte, the civilian figurehead for the junta of the time, ever condemned what happened or proposed some sort of retribution. Another exercise of the Army's key role in reform in the rhetoric of the Human Rights Administration. So you can see the U.S. government, the media cover-up. We talked about the media cover-up. We talked first about, obviously the women were tortured by the massacre of Rio Sumpol, the Carter's war against the peasantry. The women were tortured by, Rio Sumpol, the El Salvadoran troops. Nursing babies were thrown in the air for target practice. Children were drowned by soldiers or decapitated or slashed to death with machetes by U.S. government weapons. Pieces of their bodies were thrown to dogs. Honduran soldiers basically drove a bunch of Salvadoran peasants back to the Salvadoran forces for their murder. 600 unburied corpses were prey for dogs and buzzards. Children were burned and thrown into the river. It was a contaminated river. 5 children were found in a fish trap by a Honduran fisherman. And the U.S. government didn't even put it in their country reports for human rights by the sadistic, bestial butcher, Jimmy Carter. He didn't put it in his human rights. And this is a champion of human rights. This is a champion, Jimmy Carter. He's a champion slaughterer of the, third world peoples. He's a slaughtering champion of ethnic Hispanics and indigenous Native Indians. In continuing also, the U.S. press was silent through all of these things. They, basically were unaware. The peasantry continued to be murdered. and 1980 state terror under the Carter's war against the peasantry, continued. Also, this is something that the U.S. government does a lot. It, destroys the books. They don't like, Hispanic scholars and, people of, scholar ethnicity to read books, because when books talk about, ideas and dissent, they prefer, cookie cutter stuff that is just propaganda garbage, that's white supremacist lies and fabrications, so that they can murder the people and colonize them, steal their oil, steal their natural resources, distract from the actual action that they're doing, which is raping their land and plundering their land and enslaving the people and exploiting and raping and taking the natural resources for the capitalist racist frauds of Washington. That's their standard thing. 100,000 volumes were reduced to 3,000 in 3 days. So they, like vicious bandits, they burn 97,000 books. I mean, that is a really sick group of delusional frauds of the U.S. government. They do this on purpose. They deliberately get rid of books. They deliberately destroy books in ethnic lands so that they can make sure that they inundate the people with the fascist ideology that white racist dictatorship and fascist militarism is the approach over democracy. This is a racist group of thugs, of vicious gangsters of the U.S. government. They also destroyed all of the medical equipment. Medical building was burned to the ground, and 30 faculty members were murdered at the hands of U.S. government agents. And Duarte or the United States didn't even acknowledge any of these criminal acts. So, continuing on, I'm going to take a short break. It's going to be a 1-minute break. I'll be back. We only have 20 pages to go, so we should be done without no problem. Just 1 second. Okay, so continuing on. Meanwhile, the independent media were eliminated by bombings and terror, another prerequisite for quote-unquote free elections to legitimate the client regime. The editor and a journalist of one paper were found with their bodies hacked to pieces with machetes, and the second independent paper closed after 3 attempts to assassinate the editor, threats to his family, occupation, and the officer by armed forces, and the arrest and torture of staff members. The church radio station was repeatedly bombed, and shortly after Reagan's election, troops occupied the archdiocese building, destroying the radio station and ransacking the newspaper offices. As a result of these actions, there is no need for censorship in El Salvador. Western moralists may rest easy, concentrating their ire on censorship in Nicaragua, under attack by the U.S., where nothing remotely comparable has occurred. On October 26, 1980, Archbishop Romero's successor, Bishop Rivero E. Damas, condemned the armed forces' war of extermination and genocide against a defenseless civilian population. A few weeks later, Duarte hailed the armed forces for valiant service alongside the people against subversion, and he was sworn in as civilian president of the junta. Carter's war was successful. The popular organizations, dissident political forces, and the independent media were eliminated. The threat of democracy in El Salvador and fascism had been, preserved, and the democracy had been killed. A further effect of state terror was to drive many people to join the guerrillas, estimated at 2,000 in 1969. 5,000 in mid-1981, and 10,000 to 1984. But this, too, is a victory for the United States, since it shifts the struggle away from the political arena, where the U.S. and its clients are weak, to the arena of force and violence, where they reign supreme. Furthermore, as state terror undermines the opportunities for peaceful organization and meaningful political action, the victims either submit or turn to violence themselves. And as state terror mounts, they are likely to lose their popular support because they cannot defend the population and because they may be driven to adopt more brutal methods, either in self-defense or as an advocate of forces gain positions of dominance in an escalating struggle that is restricted by the outside power to the military dimension. These consequences can then be exploited by the propaganda system to provide retrospective justification for the initial resort to violence that is responsible for them in the familiar manner already discussed. The dynamics are obvious and undoubtedly well understood by U.S. planners and propagandists who have ample experience in these matters. The U.S. war against South Vietnam taught clear lessons in this regard. After the 1954 Geneva Accords, the Viet Minh, later called Viet Cong in U.S. propaganda, attempted to pursue the political settlement it outlined, but were blocked by U.S. terror, which led to the killing of tens and thousands of people in the following years. The government of the United States terrorized far more people than did the revolutionary movement. Jeffrey Race observed in the major book on the period, and the Communist Party refused even to authorize violence and self-defense for several years, though U.S. organized terrorism was decimating the Southern organization. The leading U.S. government specialist, Douglas Pike, notes that the Southern organization, the National Liberation Front, maintained that its contest with the GVN, the U.S. installed regime, and the United States should be fought out at the political level, and that the use of mass military might was in itself illegitimate until forced by the U.S. to use counterforce to survive. Captured documents also emphasize the essential role of social programs and political organizations and the need to struggle against an enemy who has been weak politically and morally, but strong militarily and materially. It took years of massacre, forced population removal, ecocide, and the general destruction before the aggressors succeeded in shifting the struggle to the arena of sheer violence. By then, the Southern organization had been virtually destroyed, along with the society that it had successfully mobilized. Peaceful political settlement and neutralization in South Vietnam, regarded as quite realistic by South Vietnamese on both sides of the conflict and bitterly opposed by the U.S. with increasing violence, was no longer a possible option, a substantial victory for the U.S., as discussed earlier. The Israeli-Arab conflict provides another example. Hysteria over Palestinian terrorism knows no bounds in the U.S. media, which over many years have largely suppressed the record of persistent U.S.-Israeli rejectionism that has been the primary barrier to political settlement. The barbaric treatment of the indigenous population of the occupied territories in what the press calls a benign occupation, and the years of murderous Israeli strikes against Lebanon without even a pretext of retaliation. To take another case, the Guatemala of the 1980s, the guerrillas lost popular support as a result of their inability to protect the population from the huge slaughter carried out with the aid of the United States and its clients. And now we see the same pattern repeating in El Salvador. Leonel Gomez, the chief advisor to the Salvadorian Institute for Agrarian Transformation, who fled in January 1981 after the assassination of the Institute's head and death squad warnings, testified before Congress that one is very cautious about rising up against the government when one has seen bodies of people sawed in half, bodies placed alive in battery acid, or bodies with every bone broken, as he had during the 1980s. A woman fleeing from the Guazapa mountain where soldiers destroyed everything after years of a ferocious bombardment says, when it began in the 1980s, the guerrillas promised us a better life. That's what we were fighting for. It hasn't turned out that way. The struggle for a better life described by Charles Clement was totally defeated as the population was murdered or removed to squalid refugee camps, a major victory for the Carter-Reagan policies. Despite official pretenses, few knowledgeable people could have much doubt about the character of what T.D. Allman, properly called Matanza II, in one of the few exceptions to media obedience. In public, the Carter administration was claiming that most of the violence was perpetrated by the guerrillas, some of the right-wing extremists, quote unquote, and only incidentally by some elements of El Salvador security forces, while the government was unable to end such abuses. Meanwhile, it was telling reporters in confidence that 90% of the killings were attributable to the government security forces. Ambassador White, in a confidential 1980 cable on El Salvador, 1 year after the coup, stated that, plainly put, the military have the power. No government can exist without their approval, and members of the security corps and the army continue to hunt down and can kill suspected leftist subversives. A very broad category indeed. Ray Bonner writes that confidential cables and documents, partially released under the Freedom of Information Act, revealed that El Salvador's political landscape was almost indistinguishable from that before the 1973 coup. The armed forces ruled employing the same repressive methods they had in 1932, in 1948, in 1972, and in 1979. In October 1980, the director of AIFLD stated in a confidential memorandum that the government here operates with no real popular support. And in the past several months, Duarte and company have sided with the conservative military, perhaps because this group holds the key power now, which he has hurt their image among the population. The conservative officials who look into military solution are very much in control. Bonner adds that no one in Washington was telling Congress or the American people this. The meaning of all this, to put it plainly, is that the government, it was wholly illegitimate, a foreign implanted supported by military forces that are hardly more than mercenaries of the foreign U.S. government power that is responsible for the violent attack against the population of El Salvador under the facade it had created. So you can see him summarizing. Carter won this war. It was successful. He destroyed the political forces, the dissident political forces, popular organizations. He shot, over 10,000 people were eliminated. The independent media was, neutralized. They, eliminated the independent media. And finally, he killed using hideous torture. Basically, we talked about, throwing the babies in the air, amputations, cutting their arms off, burning them in battery acid, all of that stuff. Basically the additional thing is, he compared it to the Vietnam conflict. He said that, basically hundreds and thousands of civilians were killed because they could turn, they could turn the war into a sheer violence. It was just, they can just turn the destruction, create the destruction of Vietnam and turn it into just a struggle for sheer violence. I mean, that's the United States, their actions. Basically that's their actions in Vietnam. He also compares it to the Israeli-Arab conflict. The U.S. media basically suppressed it. But, the murderous war of Israel and Lebanon, he discusses that. He says that the murderous Israeli strikes against Lebanon without even a pretext of retaliation. They just do it, de facto violence against Lebanon. And then we took Guatemala. The guerrillas and popular support carried out a wholesale slaughter arranged with the aid of the United States and its, colonial butcher regime, like Leonel Gomez in El Salvador. Leonel Gomez, the chief advisor of the El Salvadorian agrarian, fled, after the death squads had attacked him. Basically no one can rise up against these governments because they'll, murder you. They'll murder you if you speak a word against their, murderous military, roundup, their murderous right-wing military roundup in which they, for the white butchers of Washington, they grab people and slaughter them just in cold blood. Guatemala, we talked about, half dead bodies. Basically, he said that one is very cautious about rising up against the government when one has seen bodies of people sawed in half, like cut in half with a saw, and then your bodies are placed alive in battery acid, or bodies with every broken bone. These are, human rights. These are the human rights of the United States. This is what the United States considers human rights, of course. It's, ethnic slaughter, human rights. It's human rights for whites and ethnic slaughter and, no democracy and no books for anybody else, just ethnic slaughter for everyone else. Continuing on, Duarte's role, that's the next section. Jose Napoleon Duarte joined the junta in March 1980 as reformist elements were eliminated at the outset of Matanza II and became its president in December in an effort to provide the perpetrators of the war of extermination and genocide with some legitimacy after the murder of 4 American church women. He too certainly understood what was happening. He later conceded that the masses were with the guerrillas when he joined the junta and the U.S. organized war against the population began. Now mimicking his State Department mentors, Duarte described the guerrillas as an invading army, another manifestation of the international Red Peril. Official party documents signed by Duarte show that a few weeks before he joined the junta, the leadership of the Christian Democratic Party met with the army command to protest 19 cases in which Christian Democrats had been murdered, kidnapped, or jailed by government troops, demanding the removal of the officers responsible. The army leaders were enraged, and Duarte agreed on the spot to retract the letter. 2 weeks later, the Christian Democrat Attorney General Mario Zamora was murdered by a death squad. And 2 weeks after that, Duarte agreed to join a junta which other Christian Democrats had abandoned days before the protest over the violence, and which included officers Duarte himself had accused in party meetings of being death squad leaders. Duarte also sided with the right-wing military leaders against Colonel Adolfo Majano, the reformist officer who had led the October 1970 coup and was deliberately described by the press as the symbol of American policy in this country. Majano, who was disliked by the Carter administration, was finally removed from the junta in December 1980 as Duarte became president, after having been marginalized for some time, and shortly after was arrested. Majano later described Duarte as the military's ally who covers up human rights violations. Duarte was also well aware of the measures undertaken under his auspices to overcome the popular support for the guerrillas. For example, the reconstitution and incorporation of the civil defense forces of the 80,000-member terrorist organization Orden, which, as he had explained in 1977, employed the method that was used during the Nazi system to control the people directly. U.S. officials surely understand the scale and character of the measures they were organizing, which has now been extensively documented by human rights groups, much to the distress of the U.S. government, which has regularly attempted to undermine such groups, and of Duarte, who has denied the existence of documented massacres and now refuses to accept reports by the Church Human Rights Office because he says these people are permanently working under the direction of those trying to help the subversives. He also claimed that we use the Air Force only to support ground troops under fire, yet indiscriminate strikes against civilians are documented in grim detail by human rights organizations. Moreover, it is not only the Church Human Rights Office that is working for the subversives, but also according to the darling of the American press. He also claimed that in 1975 and 1980, the Marxist news structure dominated the U.S. press coverage of El Salvador. This, it will be recalled, is the period where the atrocities committed by the government were virtually suppressed. Furthermore, Duarte explained, David McMichael, the former CIA analyst who publicly denied unsupported government claims about a weapon flow from Nicaragua to the El Salvador rebels, is clearly a Marxist. There are infiltrators everywhere, as are many of the mothers of the disappeared. He also claimed that killings declined after he became junta president in December 1980. In fact, they increased, as all sources agree. The unions are also infiltrated and used at the altar of war and destabilization. Duarte announced after he sent his troops to the hospital where workers are on strike, one of the hospitals and clinics raided by the police in an effort to dislodge strikers. The chief government spokesman said the action was warranted on the basis of rulings by the civilian and military courts that the strike was illegal and subversive. Duarte stated that virtually all of the strikes are by the unions managed by the communists who are not interested in reasonable settlements. In fact, consumer buying power has decreased over 50% during the past 5 years, while huge sums flow abroad and the oligarchy retains or enhances its privileges, and diplomats Political observers and union leaders say that the strike resurgence reflects the widespread worker dissatisfaction with the government's economic policies, which have accelerated the steady decline of the standard of living. But as Duarte has learned, it is easier and more effective with his northern boss, the United States, to blame it on the communists while sending SWAT teams to carry out a commando raid against unarmed nurses and doctors occupying a hospital but continuing to handle emergency cases, firing the entire strike leadership of the water utility union, and otherwise providing sufficient hints to people who well recall the terror against labor unleashed a few years before by the government for which Duarte provided a fig leaf. Not surprisingly, Duarte's regime has been harshly anti-labor. The head of the 70,000-member Industrial and Civil Service Union states that some unions continue to operate underground and union membership is static because of the murders of union activists over the past 5 years, and that there will be no justice in El Salvador so long as the army remains unreformed. The machachos in the mountains want peace, he says, but they cannot leave their hideouts, surrender their arms, and join the political process because the death squads would exterminate them. Francisco Acosta, a U.S.-Canadian representative of the National Federation for Salvadoran Workers, reports that peasants are denied legal rights to organize and that the government raises numerous barriers to the technically legal organization of urban workers, making it very difficult to legalize a union. One difficulty is that union organizers are immediately accused of being communists, which means that they are fair game for the security forces. Since the labor movement started to become more active in the urban areas, there have been many kidnappings and murders and of trade unionists, but there has been no international press coverage. He added, media outrage and extensive coverage is restricted to suppression of civil liberties in Nicaragua, under attack by the United States. The Peasant Labor Coalition, Popular Democratic Unity, which backed Duarte in 2 elections, accuses Duarte of foot-dragging on trials of officers accused of violent repression, on meeting with the guerrillas movement's leaders, and on improving economic conditions. Shirley Christian reports. The organization is also in uproar over efforts, AIFLD, to confine it to the bread and butter issues, thus eliminating the danger that a popular organization might permit serious participation in democratic politics on the part of the poor. Some union leaders are accused of taking payoff from the AIFLD, the government-linked AFL-CIO organization that has miserable record of anti-labor services throughout the world. Acosta places much of the blame on Duarte's anti-labor policies on AIFLD. AIFLD naturally paints a different picture. The chief of its information services lauds the new political freedoms enjoyed by trade unionists who now live in a democracy where they can voice, no matter how loudly, their discontents with both national and trade union leadership as they're being dragged off by Duarte's security forces. Duarte's 1985 apologetics for the massacres conducted by the government, over which he presides, conform to his regular practice. After the slaughter at Rio Sampol, Duarte stated that about 300 women were killed, all of them communist guerrillas, including presumably the infants sliced to pieces with machetes. When the army killed 20 civilians in January 1983, some after torture, Duarte claimed they had been killed in a battle, that they had been murdered in scattered locations was confirmed by the press and a diplomat who investigated. In the case of the massacres at Los Llanitos and the Gualisinga River, Duarte denied the facts and blamed the guerrillas. He promised an investigation of Los Llanitos massacre, but neither the survivors who had been interviewed by church investigators nor the journalists who looked into the massacre, nor America's Watch were ever approached. Duarte did not release the report of the alleged investigation, but conducted no investigation of the Guatemalan River massacres, but denounced the terrorists, quote unquote, for using masses as shields to provoke exposing the people to be killed. This is horrible. This is inhuman. But this is not my problem. It is the problem of subversive terrorist actions that they have to be responsible, not surviving victims to see it differently. Duarte's men went after our children, and now he'll go on television to say he didn't do it. A survivor of the Los Llanitos massacre commented bitterly. No less startling was Duarte's denial that there were any bodies in El Peon and his claim that stories about this charnel house were fabricated. This charnel house were fabricated. Charnel House being a skeletal bones building, a building with human skeletal bones. This was after the press had discovered what even Elliot Abrams conceded was a hellish place, an infamous body dump, though Abrams accompanied the administration with transparent falsehood about Army innocence. What reporters found in El Payan was a macabre scene from a surrealistic canvas, a huge mass of skulls with a single bullet hole in the back, skeletons mixed in with rotting garbage, for El Payan was a dump for garbage as well as for humans, vultures and dogs devouring the bodies of the latest victims of the death squad. The U.S. Embassy investigated, concluded that the scene was even more gruesome than what reporters had described. Duarte promised an investigation after his initial denials, but several months later, when reporters discovered the new pockets of the skeletons in El Payan, the embassy acknowledged that there had been no investigation. There could be none, Bonner observes, for it would have directly led to the headquarters of several major military units 3 miles away, including the elite U.S.-trained Eclato Battalion. The road through the body dump was heavily patrolled by Army troops and security forces, America's Watch observed. I'm going to take a short break. I'll be right back. 1 minute. I just need to grab a tissue. I'm having a nose issue. Be right back. The Salvadoran military is naturally pleased with Duarte's performance. Duarte is the man who has been able to open the coffers of the U.S. Congress, and the military realizes that, a Salvadoran political analyst observes. They won't get rid of the goose that is laying the golden eggs. He's the democratic facade. So everybody doesn't have to worry because there's a democratic president there. Similarly, the economic right, the extremely conservative Salvadoran private sector, are realizing that Duarte can deliver the goods. Strangely for a populist politician, President Duarte brags in full-page newspaper ads, not about what he has done for his poor supporters, but what he has done for his arch enemies, the coffer growers. Peasants continue to be evicted by the National Guard from the lands they thought they had received under the land reform, a story that is a common one in El Salvador. The London Economist notes renewed threats by death squads that people at the university leave the country or be assassinated, a reminder that the right-wing terror machine is still in running order. The death squads are still committing murders, though on a smaller scale, while Duarte's government has not yet convicted anyone for the tens of thousands of murders committed since 1979 by the military manned death squads. Duarte has blamed the Legislative Assembly, which he now controls, but he has notably shifted to the right, reassuring the army and the businessmen that his aims are really the same as theirs. The director of National Association for Private Enterprise says, the man has been politically educated. The army, too, has come to appreciate the president's skill, both as a tactician who can use peace talks to maneuver the guerrillas, not to lend to peace with which the population yearns, and as a salesman in Washington. The official line in the U.S., repeated as a fact in news reports as well as editorial comment, is that Duarte is a reformer thwarted by the military, that is, the forces that he lauds for their valiant service in carrying out massacres and torture among the mass of the population who were with the guerrillas when the exercise began under his auspices. Defects in the Salvadoran judicial system appear to outweigh Mr. Duarte's good intentions, James Lemoyne reports, so that his commission cannot proceed with investigation and prosecution of those responsible for the Las Hojas massacre in February 1983, when soldiers murdered 74 Indians in their usual style. The basic facts of the massacre uncontested. Similar defects account for the fact that the perpetrators of other murders cannot be prosecuted, even when they are well known, or that investigations cannot proceed. To date, the planners of mass murder and state terrorism, including the murder of Americans, have not been prosecuted and retained their positions in the government. So you can see, this is Duarte, Jose Napoleon Duarte, the ruler of El Salvador. Basically, this is just the standard slaughter. He's a slaughter fest. We talked about the Rio Sumpol massacre. 300 of them communist guerrillas were killed. And who are these communist guerrillas? The infants were sliced to pieces with machetes. So communist guerrillas included the infants sliced to pieces with machetes. This is the U.S. government communist guerrillas. This is a group of sadistic, bestial, white, savage American butchers. Also, basically, the U.S. government, despite, talking about it, they basically lie. The U.S. government, to the distress of U.S. government, which has regularly attempted to undermine the rights groups. U.S. officials surely understand the scale and character of the massacres they were carrying out. And much to the distress of the U.S. government, which has regularly attempted to undermine these groups that extensively document this, and now refuses to accept reports by the Church Human Rights Office because these people are permanently working under the direction of those trying to help subversives. So anyone who, in any way criticizes the U.S. government, sadistic butchers of genocidal third world people is, basically just a subversive, someone who's a subversive, someone who's a propagandist for the other side, someone who supports the other side. These are racist, savage butchers of white supremacy, racist mass murderers, and genocidal, angry vigilante lynch mob butchers of the U.S. Congress and President and its media. We also discussed the media, the cover-ups. The media is basically covering it up in news reports, basically calling Duarte valiant service. He was, a great guy with the guerrillas. The standard, nonsense by the U.S. mass media frauds, the white frauds of the American mass media. Continuing on, ritual invocation of the theme of Duarte's bravery, moderation, and progressive commitments is a staple of news reporting. President Jose Napoleon Duarte has spoken bravely. Newsday reports and has attempted without much success to move effectively against the homicidal terror for which he has voiced approval, as noted. Duarte has had little success in restoring the rule of law and thus has been far unable to achieve any sustained institutional reform or, in fact, to do anything but please his friends in the business classes and military who applaud his education. In the rare and hence important report, Rural El Salvador, Clifford Krauss discusses the village of Carrizal, which remains today about as it was 100 years ago, with no potable water, virtual no electricity, near universal illiteracy, little land, and general suffering. Twice in this century, he writes, in 1932 and in 1980, some people in El Carrizal have organized for a better life, and twice the army has responded to those stirrings in the hinterland with repression, killing of civilians. Organizing in the provinces scarred by the 1932 Matanza is virtually hopeless since the population is terrorized. The renewed attempts in 1980 evoked new terror, reinforcing the trauma, with 27 shot when peasants attempted to organize peacefully. From 1980 to 1983, the army returned to the village once a month, keeping their eyes on things and killing 5 more people. But now Krauss reports, with a moderate government gaining the upper hand in El Salvador's civil war, and with Duarte beginning to succeed on a national level in checking such military abuses, some 300 residents met here with elected officials to discuss once again forming a co-op and getting the improvements such as potable water, a school, and a health clinic. The result, as an army truck barreled into the village and the soldiers began asking questions and taking names, that served its purpose. The people here are permanently terrorized, a village representative of an Indian peasant said. As always, Krauss characterized the goals and achievements of the Duarte regime by unsullied by evidence, untroubled by the impressive record to the contrary, to which he adds yet another item in self-retaliation. If progressivism and moderation are conferred by the presiding over one of the great episodes of mass slaughter and torture in the modern period, one hesitates to imagine what extremism might be. The standard practice standard practice of the press is nevertheless understandable. Duarte must be a moderate progressive, or we would not be justified in organizing the slaughter over which he provides. Therefore, he's a moderate progressive as a matter of doctrinal necessity, not facts, so that the actual facts may be rightly dispatched to Orwell's useful memory hole, with the sorrowful observation that the problems of this turbulent region defy simple explanation or quick fix solutions. Krauss, and of course, with no indication that the U.S. has played any role in all of this, apart from the tacit assumption that we are trying vainly to improve the lot of the villagers traumatized by the armed forces we train, supply, and direct to carry out their murderous task. The standard version, according to editorials and news columns, the ideas of most effective editorializing were the tacit assumptions of the propaganda and regularly entrenched, consists of two contradictory propositions. Duarte is a sincere reformer, but his good intentions are foiled by the fact that he has no power. Our policy in El Salvador is a success because centrist Democrats now rule El Salvador. One can have one's choice, depending on whether the task at hand is to explain away current atrocities and cover-ups, or to urge that we must proceed with the use of violence to further democracy and reform. The evasion of U.S. responsibility is the norm for news reporting and analysis. Not only in this case, it would be comical were the consequences not so horrifying. The highly regarded investigative reporter tide3 discussed the turbulence of the region in 1980, criticized the idea that Castro is the source of all the trouble, as most people in the United States believe, even though it is true that Castro has bought us the Bay of Pigs, in the same sense in which Solidarity brought us the military regime in Poland and Dubček brought us the tanks in Prague. The more sophisticated observer corrects the common error. The roots of the Caribbean problem are not entirely Cuban. The Soviet offensive in the region is to blame alongside the Cuban adventurism, as shown by the fact that the USSR rejects the notion of the Caribbean as an American Mare Nostrum. Mussolini's phrase in reference to the Mediterranean. The past contributions of England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands are also mentioned in the current unanswered question is the extent to which Cuba and the Soviet Union proposes to exploit the turbulent situation. The U.S. is merely an onlooker, blamed for its only indifference to the brewing problems. Others, like Krauss, comment sadly on the lack of simple explanations or easy solutions, or blame indigenous cultural and political factors, not false, but with notable omission. The desperate need to avoid the obvious is revealed, for example, in a review of a book that attributes the problems of Central America to religious failure. This is an appealing view, which the author skillfully and bravely elaborates, the reviewer notes. Why it takes bravery to advance the view, which is appealing to precisely because it diverts attention from the dependence of the master of the region, the reviewer does not say. As for the atrocities, at any given point, they are a thing of the past, so we can put them aside, though there is a fear that if far-rightists did not gain a share of power within the democratic framework, they might return to a campaign of terror and assassination that they intermittently waged between 1980 and late 1984. The worst atrocities were committed by the army and the government security forces, and if they were intermittent, one can scarcely imagine what the significant atrocities might be. As for the air war, we may now concede that the air forces once appeared to make little effort to avoid hitting civilians. To translate from Newspeak, it specifically aimed at civilian targets. While this was true of 1983 and early 1984, now matters are much more improved. Though the air war has stepped up and guerrillas now scattered in several small groups are relatively secure from attack. Furthermore, evidence about the air war is suspect. Much testimony can be condemning bombing comes from peasants who identify themselves as rebel supporters, from witnesses who are usually highly partisan and therefore cannot be trusted. Curiously, little eyewitness testimony about the air war comes from business circles in San Salvador and Miami. A woman in a refugee camp states that we would not stand the bombing. We had 4 years of suffering, but the reporter in San Salvador could not confirm the accounts, most surprisingly. To learn about the ongoing atrocities in the air war, as reported by the refugees in the church-run camps, we must turn to the alternative press, where we read the testimony about how this enemy was bombing us almost every day, like crazy men, with many casualties and much destruction. Meanwhile, encountered with such trivialities, we may look forward to happier days as Duarte can be expected to progress with reforms that the conservative majority previously had blocked. Duarte's role from the beginning has been to facilitate the slaughters and repression by exploiting his image as a democratic reformer, ensuring that the United States Congress provides the funding support to allow them to proceed effectively. The image carefully crafted by the United States government and the media is based on real achievements and courage in earlier years, when there is no interest here because the military dictatorship was safely in power. Since he lent his prestige to the military regime in March 1980, the true image is a far uglier one. Duarte's term has been a lesson in public relations skills, but little else. The murderers proceed unpunished, and there are few signs of imaginative approaches to ending the misery of the country. Duarte refuses negotiations and ceasefire offers despite the pleas of his own supporters, such as the centrist Popular Democratic Union, which demanded that he accept these offers by the political organization of the guerrillas, and despite the evidenced desires of much of the population, though not the military, which holds power locally, and the superpower boss running through the show through which Duarte lends his cloak of legitimacy. Basically, you could see we're just going to summarize that section. Basically the government, the U.S. government, Krauss, this is a U.S. Campaign. This is a U.S. colonial butcher campaign against the Salvadoran peasants. It was clear that, Krauss, saying that Duarte is not responsible and that things have improved under Duarte, basically is just a total fabrication of fact. The U.S. supplies weapons. They supply the murder technology. They supply the appropriate training, and they supply how to become so callous and detached of your murders, because the U.S. does it so often. Their army is responsible for such murderous campaigns that to teach this stuff is the pride and joy. It's the American pride and joy to mass murder the ethnic people. That's the white racist savage pack animals of the United States of America. They are savage white pack animals of the United States. In addition, all the rights groups have documented the information. Basically, the bombing. There was utter bombing of the civilians. Basically, they were bombed every day, almost every day, like crazy men, with many casualties and much destruction, is what the church-run camps describe. And the church groups describe the slaughter campaign. Duarte is basically an agent from the American government. He's an agent of the U.S. government. He's getting the cash and the appropriate weapons and the training and the ideological indoctrination of the racist, pack of white animals of Washington. So just give me a second. I'll be right back, and then we'll finish the book, and then I'll give my closing remarks, and we will be done. All of the information will be in the description section. See you in just a few. Towards democracy in El Salvador. The U.S. organized massacres escalated as Reagan took over. A year later, the church reported that some 300,000 civilians had been killed and 600,000 made refugees, 13% of the population. While Jeane Kirkpatrick praised the moral quality of the government that was carrying out the slaughter, and the new republic declared itself pleasantly surprised by the development of Reagan policy in Central America, which is basically right. A few months earlier, when the massacres had reached their peak of intensity and horror, the editors had given Reagan and company good marks for their performance so far in El Salvador, where they had overcome Carter's obsessive concern for quote-unquote human rights, illustrated by the slightly lower number of victims tortured and massacred during the successful campaign launched under Carter administration to wipe out the popular organizations. The numbers killed and refugees have doubled since, very likely. When the country was sufficiently terrorized and any hope of independent politics was eliminated, the U.S. ran staged elections, which are about as meaningful as elections in Poland. The farce was repeated in 1984 when elections were held in an atmosphere of terror and despair as a macabre rumor of the grisly reality. In the words of the spokesman for the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group, which observed them, while the U.S. government and media exulted in his heartening display of democracy in action, as Pravda does under comparable circumstances. The chief foreign correspondent of the London Guardian, not constrained to observe the niceties, comments that as reporters who chose to speak of voters could quickly ascertain, it was not the hunger for democracy which made people push and shove frantically to get to the front of the voting line and caused the move to turn close to panic of the time for shutting the polling places drew near, but rather fear of the army, police, or death squad reprisals if they did not manage to vote. At the conservative end of the mainstream British political spectrum, Timothy Garton Ash confirmed that most of the people voted out of fear of reprisals or because of the heavy fine for non-voting, while some voted in the hope that the mysterious ritual would somehow bring them one thing which had their desire been above all others: peace. He too ridicules blind American enthusiasm on the scene. The meaningless elections appear to be another troubling inconsistency from Ash's point of view, along with the U.S. policy towards Nicaragua. The reason is that respect for the wishes of the majority in the country is surely the moral principle behind the Salvadoran elections, on the assumption that not subject to question, that the Holy State is guided by the moral principles, which by some odd quirk it systematically violates, leading to inconsistencies. The propaganda system moves into high gear. The immediate goal of the Salvadoran army and the security forces and of the United States in 1980 was to prevent a takeover by the leftist-led guerrillas and their allied political organizations, the latter being much more important than the former at the time. The popular organization is the only social force capable of resolving the crisis in the world of the assassinated archbishop was effectively eliminated by means that merit comparison to Pol Pot, but are regarded here as either the great success or an unfortunate error. By the usual consequences, ensued people joined the guerrillas, who became a significant force, sure proof that the Russians are coming. The Reagan administration attempted to demonstrate the necessary truth in its February 1981 white paper. This was ridiculed abroad, initially accepted at home, but a strong popular opposition caused the government to back down from the move towards expanded U.S. intervention, fearing that it would prejudice other programs, such as that planned military buildup. And segments of the media then undertook an analysis of the white paper, quickly showing that it was based on severe misrepresentation and that the actual documents revealed virtually nothing, perhaps a trickle of arms beginning in September 1980, that is well after Carter's Matanza II was underway. The documents revealed the unwillingness of the USSR, and particularly Nicaragua, to permit arms shipments and chronic shortage of arms on the part of the guerrillas. The State Department conceded that the U.S. has not intercepted a sizable number of weapons since February 1981. In fact, the government has provided no credible evidence of significant weapon shipments or of Nicaraguan government involvement, despite extensive surveillance. Intelligence analysts dismiss government claims as ludicrous, and the Pentagon refuses to release documents to support official claims. In July 1984, a State Department background paper was circulated to try to help the government case, though without enthusiasm, because as the press reported, it was virtually lacking in credible evidence. A senior State Department official involved in the Nicaragua program dismissed the idea that Contras were organized to intercept arms shipments as ludicrous, and the rationale was generally dropped. The State Department background paper, which had to serve as the main source of facts for those who attempted to provide at least some basis for the war against Nicaragua, is largely a compilation of press reports and official statements. Its credibility is illustrated by the charge based on a report of Reverend Moon's Washington Times that Nicaragua has recruited Costa Rican leftists, training them for subversion in Costa Rica. The government of Costa Rica states that it has no evidence to support the charge, and a senior State Department official who has read the intelligence information behind the charge said it was extremely weak. They've taken everything that came out of the vacuum cleaner, he said. It's not the sort of thing we normally go with. Apart from the press reports of little significance, the background paper relies heavily on an ex-Sandinista security official, Miguel Bolaños Hunter, who alleges that arms were transported to the Salvadoran guerrillas through Mexico and Guatemala. So presumably they too should be attacked by the United States in accordance with the logic of the case presented by the government and its partisans. As for the Contras, their weapons include AK-47 rifles made in Poland and Bulgaria and Soviet-made SA-7 surface-to-air missiles, which have acquired by the dozens in most recent months, according to a senior White House official. It must be then that the Contras attacking Nicaragua are agents of international terror networks supported by the Soviet Union, if we accept the logic employed by the experts on terrorism, quote unquote, whose dire pronouncements dominate media discussion of this plague that threatens civilization in the modern era. The truth of the matter is that the United States is one of the leading world centers of international terrorism, perhaps the leading center. But this fact and the evidence that demonstrate it are under a strict ban and can never be permitted expression to a mass audience. Claims about captured weapons from the Soviet bloc should always be inspected with a skeptical eye. Consider the arms cache discovered in Venezuela in 1963 and presented by the U.S. government, with the press loyally trailing along as proof of Cuban subversion. Arthur Schlesinger described this great cache of weapons as unquestionably Cuban in origin and provenance, secreted for terrorists at a point along the Caribbean coast, sure proof of the central threat posed by Castro to the Americas. But former CIA agent Joseph Smith, in a book written in the defense of the CIA after Philip Age's exposure had appeared, writes that the cache may have been a CIA plant inspired by Kennedy's anti-Castro cascade, including the terrorist war against the Cuba, which Schlesinger does not mention, and which largely has been kept under wraps until today in the mainstream. The public relations director of the United Fruit Company, while outlining the success of the company's campaign to control the press at home of the 1954 CIA coup in Guatemala, observes that the phony weapons ploy was used in Guatemala in 1954 as in Vietnam through the 1960s. He also describes a plan he presented to the government of Honduras to place some Russian weapons in the hands of dead Salvadoran soldiers during the 1969 to 1970 Honduras-El Salvador conflict, and then to announce the discovery of their weapons to the press with pictures at the next news conference. Chinese weapons would have to be better, he adds. So you can see an important point here is that the U.S. government, he is stating that the experts of terrorism, the United States of America, they call themselves experts of terrorism. But he said the truth of the matter is that the United States is one of the leading world centers of international terrorism. They are the ones that internationally export terror, and perhaps the leading center. But this fact and the evidence that demonstrate it are under a strict ban by the U.S. racist, fraudulent government of the United States, and can never be permitted expression to a mass audience. So you can see that's, obviously the actions of the U.S. government, as far as, the murderous regime claims about, capture weapons from the Soviet bloc. All fabrications, Arthur Schlesinger states, all fabrications that Cuba has been supplying Nicaragua with weapons supplied by the Soviet bloc, and all CIA plant-inspired propaganda that started the propaganda system moving into high gear. So continuing on, returning to the U.S. government case against Nicaragua, apart from the worthless July 1984 document, the weakness of the government case is illustrated by the attempt of the Kissinger Commission to demonstrate Cuban-Nicaraguan instigation of violence and terrorism. The 3 pages devoted to the topic in the Commission report contain no evidence of any credibility or significance, and in general, the historical section of the report are simply an embarrassment. In September 1985, in a transparent attempt to shift attention away from the World Court proceedings boycotted by the United States, the State Department issued yet another document to buttress its claims. The report contains little information not already public about the alleged Nicaraguan aid to the guerrillas in other countries, the press observed. Even Shirley Christian, a fervent partisan of the government, could find little in any moment. Though presenting no evidence other than undocumented assertion in support of the government case, the latest effort is not entirely without interest. It states that since 1981, seahorn infiltration crossing the Gulf of Finnesca has been the primary method of infiltration. The Gulf is heavily patrolled by U.S. military forces using the highest technology at their command, and they appear to be unable to shift shipments, revealing again that we are just pitiful, helpless giant at the mercy of yellow dwarves, as Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson whined. The historical sections are also interesting. Thus, the year 1980 in El Salvador, just reviewed, appears here in the following guise after the coup coupled by reformist officers who were quickly eliminated, a fact ignored. The new junta began a series of major social and political reforms designed to address ills which seemed to justify the violence of the anti-government guerrillas. Disturbances by groups encouraged by the Sandinistas' success peaked in the spring of 1980, but by summer, as the newly united guerrillas forces began to prepare for their January offensive, the reforms began to take hold, and several straight calls received only limited support. That is the whole story. The Politburo can hardly compete in this league. The account of Nicaragua describes only how resistance forces began to take importance for the broader effort to counter Sandinista internationalism. And from 1983, armed opposition within Nicaragua, generated by the policies of the Sandinistas, continued to grow. Even granting the expectations for the state propaganda, it seems a little odd that the press can let this performance pass, merely noting that it does not prove its case. Note that the account is one that can be checked against the historical record, a fact that a rational person will use in assessing the claims made without substantiation that constitute the government's case. Use of the term resistance forces with its favorable connotation, the resistance against the Nazis, to refer to the U.S. proxy army attacking Nicaragua from its foreign bases, is a neat piece of trickery by the state disinformation machine, quickly picked up by the loyal white press, which sometimes even goes on so far as to intimate that the Nicaraguan officials refer to terrorist forces in this way. Thus we read, President Daniel Ortega or Nicaragua said yesterday his government suspended civil liberties last week to guarantee the army's defeat of U.S.-backed resistance forces, and that he said, however, the defeat of the resistance forces could create an even more dangerous situation by prompting the U.S. invasion. The government claims rest primarily on alleged material evidence that is classified, not very credible tale. It may be noted that with far more meager resources, Nicaragua has no problem providing ample material evidence of U.S. supply to the Contras fighting within Nicaragua, evidence for which, for some reason, they are not compelled to keep classified. And of course, the support, direction, and training in the foreign bases from which the attacks on Nicaragua are launched is not in question. On Nicaragua's alleged military threat, government propaganda is entirely without credibility. India barely rises to a level of absurdity unless, of course, we adopt the assumption that it is illegitimate for a country to defend itself against attack by the U.S. and its proxies. The fact that the topic is even discussed in a serious voice is a great tribute to the efficacy of the propaganda system of the United States. As for the claims about Nicaragua military might, before which we must quake in terror. Discussion of military balance in Central America is nonsensical to begin with, since the U.S. would react massively in the case of any Nicaraguan aggression, or be it more accurate, the U.S. will welcome any act that could be interpreted as aggression with unrestrained joy, since at the last long yearned invasion could be undertaken. But even if we enter this area of state propaganda, the fevered rhetoric about Nicaraguan regional predominance is easily shown to be a carefully contrived fraud. Furthermore, the evidence now available that Nicaragua can begin to acquire such military resources as it has after the Contra attack began. According to senior officials at the Pentagon, Nicaragua acquired its first Soviet-made tanks in mid-1981. Until then, and other Defense Department officials said, they had been receiving small arms and light artillery mostly. FDN spokesman Bosco Matamoros stated that armed rebels began attacks in the 1980s, which is when the Sandinista officials began complaining of the attacks. They also date their training and assistance from the Argentine military to 1980. Rand Corporation specialist Brian Jenkins, discussing indirect forms of warfare, observes that Argentina acted as a proxy for the United States in Central America, referring to the Argentina under the neo-Nazi generals during the period where the congressional human rights restrictions were hampering direct U.S. engagement in state terrorism. The formation of a large citizen militia of Nicaragua was announced in February 1981. Salvadoran aid to the Contras may have begun in 1979. The U.S. claims to have authorized CIA aid for the Contras in late 1981, allowing apologists for U.S. atrocities to maintain that Sandinistas' military buildup began prior to U.S. operations, proof of the Sandinistas' aggressive intent. This is transparent deceit by Washington, as the actual record shows, quite apart from the question of how Nicaragua is to succeed in its aggression under the U.S. shadow. Violent intervention in the region remains primarily the monopoly of the United States, as in the past. And so we discussed basically this section. The propaganda system moves into high gear. You can see it's just a deceitful group of white frauds in the U.S. media. They the case against Nicaragua, it's all a group, just a fraudulent case. It's basically undocumented assertion of the government's case is that the Gulf of Finnesca incident, which is the seaborne infiltration of the Gulf of Finnesca, the primary method of infiltration. The U.S. military forces patrol the Gulf of Finnesca, which is a gulf around the Nicaraguan border, with the highest technology in their command, and intercept shipments. They're a pitiful, helpless giant at the mercy of yellow dwarves, the Hispanic yellow dwarves, as Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson whined. So then the year of 1980 in El Salvador, is interesting. The El Salvador Just Reviewed appeared here the following guys, major and social political forms that started to address basically they were saying that they were instituting major social and political reforms that were, provided a pretext for violence. They had to, murder all the people to institute their political reforms. This is the standard stuff of Washington. Human rights becomes human slaughter, murder, butchery, amputation, spinal cord paralysis. As we always said, and I think his book is great, the U.S. calls on the mafia, to break their bones if they get out of line. They call on their military to, amputate its spinal cord paralysis. That's the United States government. The racist pack animal, savage white butchers of the United States. Continuing on, the war moves into high gear. Returning to El Salvador with the popular organizations effectively demolished, the war shifted to direct attacks against the civilian population in guerrilla-controlled areas, including ground sweeps and massacres by the U.S.-trained elites and an expanded air war. In March 1984, it was revealed publicly that U.S. planes were rapidly increasing reconnaissance to provide intelligence for what the government and press called military operations. At about the same time, the rare Reports on the air war observed bombing attacks have become much more accurate in recent weeks, quoting refugees who say they used the bombs and it wouldn't land near to the houses, but now they have something so to detect exactly where we are, so no one is safe in their homes, no one is safe anywhere. The reference is not to military operations, but rather to what refugees call indiscriminate bombing raids that have turned villages into ghost towns where every structure has been hit. People cannot cook or hand laundry, or they will become targets for airstrikes. And the remnants who have not fled spend much of their time hiding in holes in the ground to escape the unremitting air attacks that have killed many civilians. Refugees also report the use of incendiary bombs against the civilian population, either napalm or white phosphorus, according to a European doctor who inspected the wounds of victims. Soldiers from the Atlatl battalion say that incendiary weapons are used before their operations and that they have seen villages burned to the ground and large tracts of land charred by incendiary bombs. Refugees report many killed in villages of land destroyed by the incendiary bombing, along with the recently acquired anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. Use of napalm was subsequently confirmed by Dr. John Constable of Massachusetts General Hospital, a specialist on burn victims with Vietnam War experience. Congressman James Burstar reports that he was informed by Air Force Command Colonel Rafael Bustillo that napalm brought from Israel had been used until 1981. Military success in the capital confirmed that improved intelligence derived from U.S. reconnaissance is responsible for the fact that bombing attacks have become much more accurate. Relief officials and church sources report the result, not surprisingly, has been to increase civilian deaths from the bombardment. The correlation between U.S. supplied improved intelligence and the increased kill rate, including direct attacks on the defenseless peasants, received little notice in the press. When noted, the readers can offer two interpretations. The news columns, keeping to their fabled objectivity, reported that the U.S. help has not enabled the Air Force to avoid hitting civilians, according to human rights activists. The second and rather indifferent interpretation was that one provided by the activists themselves. The director of Church Human Rights Office reports a sharp increase in civilian fatalities, not guerrillas, but children, women, old people, as U.S. reconnaissance improved bombing accuracy, and suggested that the Air Force was deliberately aiming at civilians who are suspected of helping the rebels. The refugee reports leave little doubt that this is so, as it always has been so. It takes quite an act of faith to take seriously the pretense that the United States government is trying to reduce civilian casualties, but has unaccountably not enabled the Salvadoran Air Force to achieve this worthy end. The improved kill rate extends to those trapped in military operations by soldiers flown in by helicopter after receiving air surveillance information, as in the case of August 3rd, 1984 massacre by the Atlatl battalion in Los Vueltas, in which several dozen civilians were unable to escape military encirclement, died. Hedges observed that the Salvadoran Air Force had been accused of using incendiary bombs a year earlier, and that the reports were investigated by the president of the Salvadoran Commission on Human Rights, Marianela Garcia Villas, who collected tape recordings testimony from the victims, photographs of soil samples. She was killed leaving the zone by soldiers of the Atlatl battalion, according to the people who accompanied her. Her death was reported. The press reproduced government allegations that she was a guerrilla, while the British human rights publication Index on Censorship, in contrast, described her as one of the Latin America's best-known human rights workers, highly respected internationally for her testimony before UN and British Parliament human rights groups. The documentary film concerning her was broadcast in Europe, refused by U.S. public TV. It describes her early work as one of the founders of the Christian Democratic Party. Her human rights work, including the grisly chore of identifying bodies of victims of state terror, and her murder, which apparently did not violate the traditional rule of chivalry, to judge by the United States press. The Salvadoran Air Force has also employed some novel tactics, such as bombing sites where people had gathered to receive Red Cross assistance, a practice terminated by U.S. authorities after protest here, a clear demonstration of the complicity in the ongoing atrocities. The destruction and devastation have been documented by human rights groups, but generally ignored by the media. And so you can see The war moves into high gear. We see napalm and phosphorus used against civilians, American racist white frauds, the white angry animalistic pack animals of Washington's white murderous United States butchers used napalm and phosphorus against the poor civilian population in El Salvador. And, they hid the crimes. They hid all these crimes. Some of the sources said that Israel had supplied the phosphorus until, these napalm has been bought from Israel until 1981. Military sources also confirmed that the United States intelligence reconnaissance allowed the bombing attacks to be more accurate. The direct bombing of civilian areas was directed directly by the United States racist pack animal of wolves of Washington, the white wolves of Washington. Murderous wolves of Washington murdered the Salvadoran peasants in a vicious campaign using napalm and phosphorus. Nothing is, barred for Washington's angry, savage, jealous, delusional, hateful, anti-third world butchers. Additionally, the U.S. media, you could see, covered it all up. The British media reported everything honestly. The British human rights publication, Index on Censorship, described her as one of Latin America's best human rights workers, whereas the press reproduced government allegations that this person, who is Marinella Garcia Villas, basically a tape-recorded testimony of victims' photographs and samples, basically was murdered in the zone as she, fled with, all of these records of the U.S. criminal acts against the poor people. The U.S. government just peddled lies. They peddled the standard lies. The British media was much more accurate, as the British press is usually more accurate than the U.S. racist white frauds of the American mass media and the racist frauds of American academia. So the UN and British Parliament human rights groups basically said she was a highly internationally respected figure for her testimony. She was refused U.S. public TV time, but a documentary was broadcast in Europe. She was broadcast in Europe as a human rights worker, including the grisly chore she did of identifying bodies of the victims of state terror in El Salvador and her murder, which did not violate any of the international rules of chivalry for the racist white animalistic pack savages of the United States government. Novel tactics were also used. The destruction and devastation were documented by human rights groups, but again, ignored in the U.S. mass media. So you can see it's a complicit fraud. It's a group of white frauds of the American media and the dirty white supremacist, racist, mass murdering, genocidal, anti-third world butchers of the United States as they conduct their campaign of terror in El Salvador. So the last section is reaction at home, successful terror and its rewards. Let us now consider the controversy over Central America, the United States during the 1980-81 attack against the population of El Salvador. The U.S. client state had not even a semblance of legitimacy, and their election staged for the benefit of the American audience after the elimination of any other possible basis for democratic participation evidently changed the situation in a relevant way. According to the U.S., the U.S. has been engaged in the illegitimate use of force and serious crimes in El Salvador. This question, however, has barely been discussed here, just as there was virtually no discussion of U.S. intervention in South Vietnam during the comparable period, 1954 to 1954 to 1965. Furthermore, there is virtually no debate now within the mainstream media and journals over the legitimacy of this continuing attack, which is destroying much of the country and its people. Rather, debate is strictly limited to the bounds established by the state propaganda system. Within the spectrum of respectable opinion, which can reach popular audience, it is permitted to discuss the legitimacy of U.S. actions in Nicaragua, indeed. That is encouraged, since it deflects attention from the main issue. But the U.S. war in El Salvador is excluded from discussion by the state propaganda system and is therefore off the agenda. In fact, editorial opinion and commentary in journals quite generally lauds the wonderful progress in El Salvador, the one region in Central America which the United States policy clearly have been successful, quote unquote, as the U.S. backed the forces of moderation, quote unquote, upgrading the Salvadoran army and turning it into, quote, a well-honed and aggressive fighting force, fully capable of the actions documented occasionally in the news columns and far more fully elsewhere. So long as El Salvador continues to move forward as it is done under Duterte, U.S. support should be remain steadfast, quote unquote. There is good news from El Salvador, quote. Their ideal of third force has been instilled with new life, quote, as the army has much improved its conduct with American aid and the country is marching towards democracy and social reform under Duarte, who is the product of an urban middle class committed to civil liberties in El Salvador, an economic blandishment of an open society that is helped by an enlightened echelon of the Salvadoran army. He is an independent-minded man and does not accept Reagan's policies and has begun to deliver to this battered, divided people a taste of better government, a ray of hope. Though the aficionados of violence lurking on both the left and the right, he may not be able to manage the reform programs for which he is committed. The lesson is that if terror and violence appear to be successful and the threat of the fifth freedom to rob and exploit the third world peoples abates, then all is well and can return to our historical project of improving the lives of the people of Central America, those who count. As for Nicaragua, as long as the U.S. attack is not successful, there are holes in the administration's case. We learn from the New York Times that these are only practical, while the moral argument is more compelling. The administration needs a strategy that is not only moral and legal, but also persuasively wise. That is, successful in its aims, which are necessarily good. If the U.S. loses its contra option, the editors of the Washington Post explain, it may not be able to ensure the progress of the democratic enterprise in Nicaragua, to which the U.S. has always been committed. By definition, independently of the facts, turning to the Republic, we discover that the pragmatic model, as always, has nothing but scorn for those who are opposed to the principle, for reasons of international morality, to the exercise of military pressure against the Nicaraguan government. Though naturally we maintain this principle stand with regard to official enemies and profess great indignation if they adopt this stance recommended here, and we must therefore continue to use military force to push the Sandinistas to force them to do what they promised to do when they took power in July 1979 to establish a pluralist political system, a mixed economy, and a non-aligned foreign policy, exactly our goals as a century of involvement in Nicaraguan affairs clearly demonstrates to the faithful. The record of atrocities in Nicaragua and El Salvador is considered of little moment among sophisticated commentators. British journalist Timothy Garton Ash writes in the New York Review of Books that during a month's stay in El Salvador and Nicaragua, I nonetheless found, to my surprise, one or two good reasons for Western Europe's moral questioning. These reasons are rather abstract, having to do with the principle of non-interference in the sovereignty and self-determination of weaker nations, and the inconsistency he perceives in elections conducted out of respect for the wishes of the majority, in which largely illiterate peasants are forced to vote, and U.S. policy towards Nicaragua, inconsistencies that arise only on conditions of abandonment of rationality and naive faith in the official doctrine, as already discussed. Truly, the skeptical and very knowledgeable conservative correspondent was aware before his visits of the tens of thousands of tortured and mutilated victims in El Salvador, the terror of the air war, the physical destruction of the political opposition, and the destruction of the media, and so on. But these did not provide any reason for moral questioning then, nor do they afterwards. Evidently, the moral level in these cultivated British circles has changed little since the days when Winston Churchill, then Secretary of State at the War Office, expressed his attitude towards the use of poison gas in 1919, shortly after the furor over its use by the Germans, a major war crime. I do not understand this using poison gas against uncivilized tribes, namely against the tribesmen of Mesopotamia and Afghanistan, and against the Bolsheviks in Russia during the 1919 intervention, when the first use of chemical weapons in air warfare was considered by the British GHQ to be the primary factor in early military successes. In short, what has been done to El Salvador and Nicaragua is taken to be the prerogative of the United States, or as knowledgeable cynic might say, the historical vocation. The debate in mainstream circles, as noted, is contained strictly within the framework established by the state propaganda system. Is Nicaragua offering assistance to guerrillas in El Salvador? That is, in the real world, the people defending themselves from American terror. The U.S. government claims that it is, and is thus engaged in an armed attack against El Salvador, which entitles the U.S. to respond in collective self-defense. Critics note that the evidence is unconvincing and therefore question whether that Nicaragua is guilty of such an armed attack. But the major issue, clearly, is the American attack against much of the population of El Salvador, and the issue is excluded from the framework of debate set by the state and accepted by the critics. Even the U.S. peace movement is in part guilty of this moral crime. The Pledge of Resistance, under which many people have been arrested for civil disobedience, refers to aggressive acts against Nicaragua, not to the far more horrifying crimes in El Salvador. Similarly, in the 1960s, the debate focused primarily on the bombing of the North, murderous and destructive, but not on the scale of the war against South Vietnam. Both cases, the right of the U.S. to attack and destroy is tacitly conceded, so long as there are no threatening international complications, a fact that reveals a good deal about the power of the state propaganda system of the United States to set the terms of discussion and about the principles that guide critics within the mainstream and sometimes even beyond. What is more, it would be quite legitimate to provide military and aid to people attempting to defend themselves against the depredation of a violent superpower, whether in El Salvador, South Vietnam, Afghanistan, or elsewhere. If properly intimidated, a government may not do so, but it is another matter. T.D. Allman describes how a man, after telling a harrowing tale of the government atrocities and violence in a Salvadoran town, asked about a place called Cuba, where somewhere beyond the seas, where he had heard there were people who might provide the suffering population with aid. He asked how we might contact these Cubans to inform them of our needs so that they might help us. Few Americans seem to be able to comprehend the meaning of this plea, though it would arouse great anguish if uttered by victims of some official enemy. In this case, as in others, formidable American power and success of our system of brainwashing under freedom, quote unquote, are rarely appreciated. So you can see an excellent, half chapter, patterns of intervention. We did El Salvador, basically Carter's war on El Salvador and the state propaganda system. We discussed all of the different, torture techniques that were used by the U.S. government. And I'm going to just summarize the last section. The U.S. attack. It was all just, fabrications. Everything was just fabrications. The New York Times admitted that the moral argument is compelling that the U.S. attack in Nicaragua should go on. Basically the Washington Post explained if the U.S. loses the Contra option, it may not be able to ensure the progress of the democratic enterprise in Nicaragua, to which the U.S. has always been committed by definition. Independently of facts, basically the facts are that the U.S. is interested in quashing Nicaraguan democracy and enforcing a fascist American state-backed terror system against the Nicaraguan people. And this is the standard thing. The racist, white, sadistic, detached butchers of Washington, the genocidal, white, racist butchers of Washington, they take the people and they slaughter them. There is no problem as long as their capitalist cash and their colonial resources are used and siphoned into the American treasury. America increases its number of cash, the cash flow through the American treasury, and the transaction are simply the peasants that are slaughtered by American weapons. So it's an all-win situation for America to murder mass of the Hispanic peasants and indigenous Indians in El Salvador. In addition, the state propaganda system is just, ruthless. It is a ruthless American state propaganda system. The premise of the Reagan administration was that is Nicaragua offering assistance to the guerrillas in El Salvador? The U.S. government is murdering en masse in El Salvador, so it is within the rights of the Nicaraguan government to protect the Hispanic peasants in El Salvador, something that Washington could never conceive because, they are the white racist mass murdering butchers of the American government. So they would never concede such a thing. But, even still, they were not found to be helping the rebels in El Salvador. They were not found. Yet the propaganda continued by the Reagan administration, saying that Nicaragua was helping the rebels and, creating a vicious, a vicious campaign against Nicaragua. Economic sanctions, murder weapons, all of this stuff was used in lavish against the poor people of Nicaragua, and the Sandinistas were left, reeling for weapons and some sort of military approach to approach the U.S. terror state, the U.S. international terrorist state of the United States. So that's basically it. That's the book, Turning the Tide by Noam Chomsky, U.S. Intervention in Central America, The Struggle for Peace. I'm going to finish with a few closing comments. It'll be very short. And then, I'll have all the description and the book link so that you can download it from my Google Drive link. So the white racist, angry vigilante whites of American government committed criminal mass murder, sadistic acts with the normal detached American approach to the great third world peoples. Let us discuss the few of the actions that we review in Chomsky's book. Theodore Roosevelt, the white American government, racist, anti-ethnic, genocidal, third world butcher of bestiality, who was a South African apartheid racist president, robbed the Colombian Panama Canal and used the Monroe doctrine to slaughter like a white lynch mob butcher in both Latin America and the Philippines. His action has been condemned broadly in Latin America, despite the American deliberate lies that he is a champion of equality. He is a champion of third world ethnic and black slaughter. American government racist, colonial, bestial, white murderous butcher was evaluated by two major South American scholarly outlets. Views put forth by Connell Smith was that the dominant position of America in the Western Hemisphere under Roosevelt is like the English-speaking race in South Africa and was meant to civilize the Hispanic Philippines and black race. La Prensa of Argentina noted that Roosevelt's statement was the most serious and menacing declaration against South American integrity coming out of Washington ever. Let us next consider El Salvador and Jimmy Carter's butchery in El Salvador. U.S. organized massacres in El Salvador by Jimmy Carter, the white butcher of the third world peoples, and Gestapo of the United States, murdered some 30,000 civilians and made some 600,000 refugees. This is typical of the white racists of Washington. The American politicians, Democrat, quote, and Republicans, the Democratic Congress of the Carter years and president, would have no problem creating 13% of a population of a country as refugees. It allows them to continue the vicious mass murder campaign against the poor people of El Salvador. The sadist in chief Jimmy Carter was a human rights champion of the thrashing of infants against rocks, the amputation of women and children, the gang rape of women, and the removal of women's wombs and placing them in her mouth while alive, pulling the child out of the womb of a woman like an egg. Eggs are pulled out of the iguana is characteristic of the sadistic butcher of Washington, Jimmy Carter's third world human rights program. Let us take another case in torturing Nicaragua. As Chomsky discusses, the United States has a long history of the murderous action. Starting in 1854, the American Navy burned down the town of San Juan del Norte to avenge an alleged insult to American officials and the American millionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt. The press did discuss the Contras conquering the town under the mass murder and white butcher Ronald Reagan, but omitted this history. As usual, the white frauds of the U.S. government and its press lie for the state. This is allowed in America. The fascist, racist regime of the United States allows anyone in a position of power to lie for the state. Also in 1944, the U.S. racist white vigilante murderer, Franklin Roosevelt, that under U.S. civil and military control, tens of thousands of Nicaraguans were killed in a few months. The anti-third world white butchers of Washington executed large numbers of Nicaraguan political dissenters and Hispanic scholars and free-thinking world people. The Sandinista government, by contrast, was much more progressive and liberal in its treatment of people. The white mass murderer and genocidal butcher Ronald Reagan organized the Contras in Honduras under the assistance of Argentine neo-Nazis in 1980 and 1981, and pilots of Reagan bombed Nicaragua under CIA control from its sanctuaries in Honduras and El Salvador. U.S. officials in Central America admitted the CIA assisted sorties a dozen times a week from El Salvador, deep into Nicaragua to supply the murderous Washington white butcher agents of American terrorism, the Contras. Arms were smuggled in the U.S. Center for International Terrorism in Miami, where the FDN leadership, or Contras, has its political offices. CIA helicopters provided cover for these murderers. CIA mothership launched seaborne commander raids to mine Nicaraguan harbors. Washington's white pack animals of Reagan, Hagen, Kirkpatrick were trying to force Nicaraguan progressive, popular, and democratic government to be forced to spend military money rather than on its social programs. The jealous, hateful whites of Washington thus forced the poor Nicaraguans into a position of vulnerability to their murderous white butchers of the third world. Poor peasant families were being given social programs, including health, education, and agriculture, which did not do well for the white murderous dogs in Washington. This is a no-no, asking for independence and sovereignty as a third world person, as well as the education and health care. Is all a no-no for third world peoples because the jealous, hateful delusions of Washington of third world health and wellness. The American media and academia white frauds painted the Sandinistas as an evil empire and agents of Soviet communism, even though they were not getting anything from the Soviet Union. The white delusional genocider butchers of Reagan and Kirkpatrick is an unwritten part of the American racist murder butchers of Washington. Now let's turn to Haiti and Dominican Republic, or Hispaniola. Christopher Columbus, the American white butchers celebrate in the New World Christopher Columbus for their, your appreciation of sadistic and criminally insane whites. This criminally insane, sadistic white butcher, Woodrow Wilson, who put the nigs, quote unquote, of Haiti into their place through murder, theft, rape, torture, imprisonment, and the damn Dagos, quote unquote, of the Dominican Republic to a similar plight. The white racist rabid dog of Washington established U.S. economic and military control, as well as control of Haitians and the Dominicans' food intake that was very minimal. A brutal 5-year counterinsurgency operation, an 8-year military campaign, which condemns the Latin American countries to the lowest living standards in Latin America, continues today. At the end of Wilson's white supremacist party in Hispaniola, Dominicans have $1.4 million and Wilson's companies held $34 million. Wilson's white warriors, machine gun peasants, raped, tortured, and destroyed houses, imprisoned many people, and sent many to concentration camps. Bombed and machine gun indiscriminately populations of civilians, and generally abused the, quote, spigs and, quote, niggers in what is generally referred to as Wilson's white man's burden to bring civilization to these people. Quote, spigs and, quote, nigger testimony was dismissed as unreliable as to the atrocious behavior of Wilson's warriors. Woodrow Wilson is an angry white lynch mob vigilante, criminally insane, genocidal butcher of third world peoples. Turning to Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz was creating a nationalist movement for the United States. Fruit Company and similar Guatemala Natural Resources was trying to expropriate land that the United Fruit Company had illegally acquired and transfer it to landless peasants. This enraged the white, sadistic, criminally insane racist butchers Eisenhower and Dulles, President and Secretary of State in 1959. The communist conspiracy of a communist takeover in Latin America was used as a pretext for the murderous campaign against the Guatemalan people. The CIA engineered a coup in 1954 in which Arbenz was murdered by the racist agents of Washington. As a result of Eisenhower and Dulles, the Guatemalan economy collapsed, mass starvation occurred, and then the beneficiaries of Arbenz's movement dispossessed, the peasant cooperatives dissolved, and labor unions destroyed, and then the white butchers began their murder campaign against the Hispanic and indigenous peoples. Infants were thrown against rocks, women were raped and dismembered, men were disemboweled, women's wombs were cut, and men's genitals were cut out and placed in their mouth. The repressive regime of the Washington butchers of Eisenhower and Dulles murdered hundreds and thousands of Hispanic and indigenous population of people. The program was continued under Kennedy and Johnson, which started in 1963 when Arevalo had again taken power, under which Kennedy organized a military coup and rapidly expanded the state terror, which was enthusiastically supported by the racist whites of Congress. Then this was followed by Johnson as sadist-in-chief, who slaughtered perhaps 10,000 peasants by the Green Berets. U.S. planes also napalmed and bombed Guatemala from Panama, according to Guatemalan President Rojas. Continued impoverishment of the population and indescribable terror were carried out by the racist white butchers of Washington. More than 40,000 people disappeared and more than 95,000 people were murdered by the criminally insane sadists of the United States. Over 100,000 people were, put it simply, were eliminated by the U.S. government since the United States had overthrown Guatemalan democracy in 1954. The assassinations, as described by Guatemalan Conference of Bishops, have reached a genocide. 50,000 Indians of the Maya tribe were also butchered at the hands of the white rabid dogs of Washington's university and schools that were targeted by the racist white politicians of Washington who murdered professors and scholars who called out the American government's lynch mob crimes. In summary, the only crime of these people were to request their birthright resources, including their oil reserves, farming industry, sugar plantations, fruit plantations, and other crops, as well as textiles. The white mass murderers of Washington ripped this birthright privilege of the third world peoples away from them, as they have done so many times throughout the world. The angry white vigilante bestial murderers of the United States government hide these crimes through their ability to lie for American state terror. And so we discussed the book, Turning the Tide. I will have all the information in the description section. I will have another podcast, finish that chapter tomorrow. Glad you could enjoy it. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank. Hope you can have a nice day.